Good evening and welcome to everyone who's joining us either in person or on Zoom. I'm hoping this is the right camera that I'm talking into right now. Fabulous, thank you. We're so glad to be together to share in an evening of personal stories. I'm Rabbi Sam Blumberg, honored to open the program tonight on behalf of the LIZKOR committee, our wonderful LIZKOR committee. Tonight we continue with our LIZKOR to Remember initiative with another evening of personal sharing from Temple Beth Am members as we invite longtime TBA member Julie Wolfe to share her family story that she's titled Flora Krigsman, a story of cousins, coincidences, and filling in the blanks. We look so forward to hearing about all those blanks you filled in. In our weekly Torah portion cycle, we find ourselves coming towards the end of the book of Genesis, which is filled with rich and complicated stories of our forebears, of the first Jewish families, intimate stories from the past that shape who we are in the present. The mission and the focus of our LIZKOR program is to honor our past for future generations, an ingrained Jewish value that has enabled our people to persevere and find strength even in the most difficult times. Before we begin tonight's program, a huge thank you first to our incredible LIZKOR committee and headed by, of course, Ellie Anbinder, whose enthusiasm really keeps us going. Thank you, Ellie, and thank you to everyone who's on the LIZKOR committee. And a huge thank you also to Bill Rabkin and to Howie Goldberg, who are helping us with our technology tonight. A huge part of what we're doing with these LIZKOR programs is holding on to, preserving these stories. And so the video piece of it, the technology piece of it, is so huge. So thank you to Bill and to Howie. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Julie Wolfe. Julie Wolfe and her family have been members of Temple Beth Am for 15 years. During that time, she's served on the Caring Committee, as school committee chair, and as vice president of education. After a brief hiatus, we are very grateful that she's returned to the Board of Trustees as recording secretary. Anyone who has sat in meetings or presentations with her knows that she is a compulsive note taker, those were her words, which has served her well as an armchair genealogist. Having had the privilege of working as an editor on the companion books for the first 2 seasons of PBS's Finding Your Roots, opened her eyes to the thrill and importance of genealogy. Not only the researching of it, but the recording of it. Members of her extended family were both victims and survivors of the Shoah. And tonight she's sharing the story of one such relative and her immediate family and the roundabout path she took to fill in missing details. Thank you, Julie, for sharing your story with us tonight.
Thank you all for attending in person and on Zoom, and extra thanks to Lila Wolf-Wagner, my assistant tonight, who created the slideshow for me and handled my technological shortcomings with eternal patience and grace. So thank you, Lila. Okay. So I'm just going to jump right in. So I grew up in South Florida, where everyone's grandparents lived, including my own. My sister and I would see people at the supermarket or at my grandparents' clubhouse pool with numbers on their arms. But our family's Holocaust stories seemed much more distant than that, and they were about extended family, not our own grandparents. Spoiler alert, though, no Jewish person's Holocaust histories are that distant. For someone of my generation, extended family only reaches back 1 and 2 generations. And there were 2 Holocaust stories from our family that I knew. Number 1, my grandpa's youngest brother, Saul, died in a concentration camp. From what I understood, I believe that Saul, like his many siblings, had immigrated to America, but returned to Europe to save his fiancée, a heartbreakingly romantic gesture that ended in tragedy. Number 2, there were 2 cousins exotically named Jacques and Flora, who survived the war after being hidden in a convent in Belgium. They were probably orphans. I didn't know their parents' names. They spoke French when they arrived in America. Both stories have loomed large in my mind since I heard them as a child. The fact check rating on these would be number 1, partly true, and number 2, mostly true. In taking on this project, I had 2 goals. 1, to get clarity on why this young man named Saul would return to Nazi-occupied Europe when he was safe in America, and 2, to trace Jacques and Flora's journey from their home in Belgium to a convent. Were they parentless and wandering the countryside when they were rescued by nuns? And how did they come to be so fortunate to be rescued and survive? So with Ancestry and Genie at my fingertips, I set out to fill in the blanks. But what I didn't know is that first I would connect the dots. One of my mother's Krigsman cousins set up an elaborate page and family tree on Genie. I don't know this cousin or any cousins on the Krigsman side of the family because the family wasn't close, which likely explains many of the question marks that I had. But family is family, so I poached my early information from his website. Now, according to the family tree, Saul Krigsman was born in 1914. And also according to the tree, as suspected, there was no wartime fiancé. Our family's life was not a Hollywood movie. Saul had a wife, Gittel Mokazanska, also born in Poland. And Saul and Gittel had 2 children who happened to be born in Brussels, who happened to be named Jacques and Flora. With a click of a link on Saul Krigsman, 2 branches of my family tree became one. Jacques and Flora weren't parentless, and Saul was not a lovesick teenager. According to Genie, Saul visited the U.S., Brooklyn, around 1939, where his brothers lived, to scout out opportunities for his family to emigrate from Brussels. He was told when doing so that there were no further shipping connections to the U.S., so that his family must remain in Europe. And it says, told to his cousin Erwin when Erwin was a child. So that meant the transatlantic journey was true, but the details had been off. The text goes on to say the German Nazis deported Saul from Brussels in 1944. His wife was killed by the Nazis earlier. And then, through the careful planning of Saul and his wife, their children, Jacques and Flora, were able to survive the Shoah. So much love and death and heartbreak are included in those brief sentences. The line, through the careful planning of Saul and his wife, brought out a lot of emotion in me. And it seemed that I had my answers and my work was done. Yet, there's about a half hour left of this presentation. So what's left to say? Well, any of us who have dived headfirst into researching our family histories know there's always more to learn. There's always another name to click and some surprise lurking around the corner. I reread that phrase, told to his cousin Erwin when Erwin was a child. Not diminishing Erwin in any way, because this family tree is both godsend and goldmine. But were his recollections accurate? Could Saul even have come to the U.S. in 1939? Maybe, because I still haven't been able to prove otherwise, but the quota systems at that time were literally deadly to Jews. We also know that my childhood interpretations of my family history were close, but they were off. Maybe Erwin's were too. But it turns out that Erwin's fact-checking rating would also be mostly true. So always trust but verify. Now my questions ballooned, but so did my resources. Because on this Genie page was a long list of names I'd never seen or heard, mouthful surnames like Mokazanska and Chonyaki. These were the names of Saul's wife's family. They were not our relatives. I've spent enough time around finding your roots to know that names are a gift. And when someone hands you a gift, it's impolite not to open it, and you must always, always thank them for it. The name was Saul's wife, Gittel Krigsman Mokronska. I clicked. Thank you, Erwin. Lila, next slide, please. Okay, so here is a graphic that my husband Keith was able to figure out how to make when I had just written it all out on paper. And I'm just going to show you how the main characters in the story are related to each other. So Flora in the bottom middle box is pretty much our central character. And she and my mother Harriet were first cousins. Their fathers were brothers. Jacob, who's on the right, last name Chonyaki, is critical to the story. He and Flora were also first cousins. Their mothers were sisters. In other words, we're not related by blood to Flora's maternal first cousin, Jacob. But you will see after my presentation that we are now profoundly connected. Lila. Okay, so that is the Krigsman family with their 3 youngest children who also happen to be boys. So I'm not sure what year this was taken, probably 1920. Those are my great-grandparents, Hirsch and Gittel Krigsman, who would become Harry and Gertrude, and their 3 youngest sons. The one on the left is my grandfather, Irving. He was born in 1909, and he's probably about 9 or 10 here, I would guess. And the other 2 are Benny and Saul. Lila. Thank you. Now, you can see there were a lot of children in the Krigsman family. My grandfather and all of his siblings were born in Grudges, Poland. My mother taught me how to say that last night, and I think I just butchered it, but it kind of sounds like grudges. Note that the youngest boy, born in 1912, is named Benjamin. He's no connection to my Benjamin, but it is not Saul. The family story said Saul, also known as Simon, was the youngest, and the genie tree said he was born in 1914. He wasn't. More on that later. So you can see I put asterisks next to Natan, Shlomo, and Saul. They were all murdered in the Shoah. There may have been as many as 4 other siblings whose names are not known, also presumed to have been murdered in the Shoah. And I'm not convinced Shlomo is a brother, but we will get to that a little later. He may or may not be. Lila, next slide, please. And this is just kind of interesting. I thought these are my great-grandparents' Polish passports, which are stamped in 1928, which I'm assuming is when they immigrated. And you can see their names, Hershik and Gisha, I guess, or Gila Krigsman. The spellings, I tried to standardize the spellings, but, I did my best. They were Krigsman in America with a G, Krigsman. So, Lila, can you flip? Thank you. Okay, so this is, I love these ship manifests. This is a ship manifest from 1929 for my grandfather, Isaac, I-C-E-K Krigsman, Irving, and his brother Benjamin. And now please keep Benny in mind, because he'll be important later in the story. Now, some manifests tell you who in America the person was going to be meeting. This one doesn't, but they were probably meeting their parents and perhaps some of their older siblings who I believe had immigrated already, but not Saul. So why aren't they meeting Saul yet? Thank you. Here's another ship manifest from 1 month later. The reason they weren't meeting Saul is because he wasn't there yet. Saul, on the ship manifest called Shruel Krigsman, nationality Pole Heb, came to America 1 month later, according to this, in February of 29. One would think that, like his brothers, he had come to stay. But had he? I'm not sure. This manifest is titled Record of Aliens Held for Special Inquiry. I don't know why he was held for special inquiry, but presumably he was released because this picture on the next slide was taken. And that is the Krigsmans in America and their 5 living sons. I don't think the authorities would have released him on the grounds that he had an appointment at a portrait studio. So, he must have been cleared to go. And so here they are, looking pretty newly minted and fresh and swank. I'm assuming this was 1929. And I also especially like the boater hat that my great-grandfather is wearing. And Keith pointed out he looks about 100 years younger in this picture than he did in the picture in Poland, which was only about a decade earlier. So, and now that's just the detail, a little close-up of Saul. And for what he went through, he deserves a close-up, especially because I left his name out of the title. And when I do a sequel, his name will be in the title because I learned, after I titled it, I learned a lot more. And he's a very central character. This was amazing. Abby and I found this the other day in a photo album. There were so many amazing finds throughout this project, but the 1-2 punch of this one and Saul's ship manifest were standouts. This is a visa application submitted to the U.S. government by my grandfather, who had been in America for 3 years at this time, seeking permission for his brother Saul, called Shul, on the document, it's hard to see in the middle. He was seeking permission to get a visa to have Saul immigrate to America. This wasn't scanned from Ancestry. It was in a photo album that had belonged to my grandparents and then my parents, and now Abby, my sister, has it in her basement. So it details my grandfather's immigration status first, and then gets to the heart of the matter. Irving Krigsman, age 21, being duly sworn, deposes and says that he is the brother of Shul Krigsman, age 27, now residing at Rue de Lange, Brussels, Belgium, who desire to come to the United States to join him and the rest of his family, and whom he is most anxious to bring over. So wait a minute, so this gets to the age. If Irving was 21 and Saul was 27 in 1931, I am certain no one was fabricating ages, then Saul was most definitely not the youngest brother. His date of birth, 1904, was also confirmed in a ghastly document that we'll see later. So that is one myth of the story dispelled definitively. He was not the youngest. And if Saul was in America in 1929, but Belgium in 1931, as this visa application tells us, then it's quite possible that he went back to Europe because, thank you, the woman he loved, Gittel Morzanska Krigsman, was still there. I don't know what year they married, so I can't know whether he returned to a fiancée or a wife. But between 1929 and 1931, whenever in this window Saul returned to Europe, Europe was not yet war-torn, and he did not return to rescue his fiancée. I'll need more documentation to prove this absolutely, but the evidence seems strong, and I feel confident saying that the mystery of story number 1 is solved. Trust but verify. Now, the photograph is from around 1933. It's Saul and Gittel and their son Jacques, who was born in Brussels in 1932. Flora wasn't born until 36, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find a picture of the family of 4. I hope one exists, but I don't know if it does. Now this just brings me to a point that I want to make about oral histories and family histories. You must be both grateful for them and skeptical of them. Skeptical because people misremember and mistype and mislabel, but grateful because another family member took precious time to record names and dates that you might never otherwise have access to. A Krigsman cousin of my mother's generation and his son painstakingly recorded any name and date they had at their disposal. So thank you to them for doing that. Can you turn the slide? Okay, this is where things got pretty exciting. This is the Ancestry page. Now remember what I said about Jeannie and Ancestry and clicking and pursuing any lead you might have. By this time, I was getting nowhere with any spelling of Krigsman. Saul Krigsman, forget it. I kept being sent back to the same Jeannie link over and over again. Flora Krigsman, our title character, brought me to her high school yearbook, a naturalization card, and not much else. But I thought maybe by going through her mother's family, I could somehow get to her. And through Flora's mother, I hit the mother lode. This is a page from Ancestry. I'm assuming a lot of you have been on Ancestry, but maybe not. So the name at the top is Jacob Mariel. There is no one by that name. No one named Jacob Mariel. But according to the Jeannie family tree, there was a nephew named Jacob Chonyaki, who we met on the diagram slide. On Jeannie, he's mislabeled as a stepson, so you really have to keep, believing or not believing. Now, under Jacob Mariel, in the transcription, you can see that it says Marcel Chonyaki. Marcel was another nephew, Jacob's brother. Now, if you're very lucky, the page you land on Ancestry will bring you to an even better one through the suggested records. And if you look down at the red arrow, you can see it says U.S. Shoah Foundation Holocaust Jewish Survivor Interviews. So I'm pretty sure my hand was shaking when I clicked on that. And can you go to the next slide? So now, even looking at this again, I'm speechless and I'm getting goosebumps. Now remember that my Uncle Saul was also called Simon. And there they are. I put a little red box around them. The Krigsman family. Simon, Gittel, Florette, and Jacques. And they are listed among the contents of the interview. That's what all those names are. Their story is preserved somewhere in the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive of 55,000 plus survivor testimonies. Thank you, Steven Spielberg. So I then went to that website, VHA website, and searched Chonyaki, expecting to come face to face with Marcel. It wasn't Marcel. It was his brother, Jacob Chonyaki, to whom I will be forever indebted. Through Jacob, Flora's first cousin on his mother's side, I was able to learn directly about the lives of the Krigsman family in Brussels in the years leading up to the war. Now, when Jacob ceases to include the Krigsman family in his story, I was able to extrapolate what the lives of Jacques and Flora looked like, what path they followed, and where the convent came into play, all because of Jacob's story. And I don't have video clips for you to watch because the VHA site was down for the entire duration of this project. I can't tell you how many times I tried everything to log on. But I have watched the whole thing, obviously. I will tell the story in Jacob's own words as much as possible. He offers insights into the normal lives they lived before the war and how everything changed irrevocably for both families, the Chonyakis and the Krigsmans, with the Nazi invasion of Belgium in 1940. Now here is Jacob's story and, by extension, Jacques and Flora's. So that's Jacob's family, his parents and the 5 children, and then I'm assuming the little insert is the youngest boy who obviously wasn't born yet when this picture was taken. A little about Jacob. Jacob Chonyaki was born in Kaminsk, Poland in 1929 to Meyer Chonyaki and Ruchel Mokazanska. Ruchel was the older sister of Jacques and Flora's mother, Gittel. His father, Meyer, was a tailor who had his own store. Uncle Saul was also a tailor, and my grandfather and Benny were also knitters, that's what they all did, apparently. Now, in 1931, Jacob's parents, picture here, moved from Poland to Belgium in pursuit of a freer, more liberal country. If you recall, my grandfather sought a visa for Saul in June of 1931, and he already lived in Belgium, meaning that the two sisters either moved to Belgium at the same time or one quickly after the other. Indeed, Jacob tells us our uncle and aunt and cousins lived on our street a block away. Auntie Giddle was 10 years younger than my mother. We used to play with Jacques and Florette. I used to ask my uncle for a little money. Jacob liked to go to the movie house and ice cream shop across the street. He says it was a nice neighborhood for kids to grow up in, and I hope Uncle Saul gave him money to buy an ice cream. Now, Florette would have been too young to go to the movies during this time. She was born in 1936. But Jacques was born in 1932, just 3 years younger than Jacob. He might have joined in. Jacob said there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism in Belgium before the war, describing how the teacher would say, "If you go pull the beard of the rabbi, I'll give you 5 francs." Around the high holidays, he said there were royal battles with the Goyim outside the school. The Jewish children had yellow identity cards, the Belgians had green. Jacques probably would have had similar experiences being of school age. Now, once again, Flora is too young. Lila? Okay, so here's a young Jacob, Choniaki in Brussels. And he said it was a normal way, this was really touching what he said. It was a normal way that we were developing, enjoying life. Our memories of our childhood are quite pleasant. These normal years gave us enough to get through the rest of our lives. His parents' French was minimal. They spoke Yiddish at home, while the kids spoke French at school. They spent a fair amount of time with Jews, Jacob said, but his father would have had non-Jewish customers. He says there wasn't a lot of talk about Hitler in their home, and they didn't know any Polish refugees. They had, quote, a very vague idea, and Jewish people did start to become, as he says, afraid of what might happen later. His parents sent food parcels to Poland on a fairly regular basis till the beginning of the war in Belgium, but there was no longer regular contact, if any, after that. Jacob remembers clearly the day of the Nazi invasion of Belgium, May 10th, 1940. It was a beautiful sunny day, he said. We heard planes and sirens, and we knew it was because of something terrible. At this point, he said, all the Jews believed the Nazis were butchering every Jew left, right, and center. And I'm guessing in this picture, he was probably a little younger than when the invasion happened. Now, the invasion of Belgium was obviously a turning point in the war, and for the Jews of Belgium. What happened next is the stuff of movies, except it was real life. Jacob said, what our family did, like most Jewish families did, we packed up and took off on foot and tried to run away. Only his oldest sister, Blima, stayed behind. She met a young fella, her non-Jewish boyfriend, Serge Delacroix, and together they were involved in the Belgian resistance. Serge's father owned a bike shop in Brussels that was a front for the resistance. Can you turn the slide, please? In Jacob's words, all of us, with my uncle and aunt, the Krigsmans, with their 2 children, we took off toward the Belgian coast because we saw the British soldiers. Some Brits came trying to get people toward the coast. Their goal was to get on a boat to France and ultimately go to England. So the top map is Brussels to Dunkirk, which is about where they ended up, and it is 95.5 miles. He says, we were on the road for 2 weeks. We had the most frightening experiences, sleeping in barracks, in fields, no food. If you've ever seen a movie all the refugees, it looked like that. They got close to Dunkirk, having walked nearly 100 miles, as you can see there. He says there was very little food. Bombs were falling. The experience, he said, was hair-raising. He also notes that there wasn't a lot of camaraderie, and that's probably something we don't like to think about. We probably like to think that they were all in it together, but he said every Jew was in the same boat, and people were not very friendly to each other. And then he goes on to say, the youngest were in strollers. Florette was in a stroller. Israel, his youngest brother, may have been in a stroller. The families made it to the French border. He describes the surrealism of the scene. One night I was eating raw potatoes. A British officer came walking proudly with his cane, as if it were nothing. That left an impression. And then he says, word went around. The Germans were occupying, but you may as well go home. And then he said, besides, what was the chance of getting to England? Unless you knew someone with a couch willing to take some choniakis and some Krigsmans, there was no chance to run away. Eventually, we walked back to a major city, maybe Ghent, and got in a German vehicle and drove back to Brussels. We went home. So you can see on the bottom map, Dunkirk to Ghent. The miles didn't print out, which was the wrong format, but it's about 65 miles. So these people walked close to 160 miles. And Flora was 4 years old. Now for contrast, I would like to show you a picture of a 4-year-old in America in the 1940s, around the same time. Lila. That's my mother. Harriet Krigsman in Brooklyn, New York, also around 4 years old. In that picture, probably a little younger, on the pony. And, it was really jarring to think what Flora's few years older than my mother, but the idea is the same, that's what you think a little child should be doing, not fleeing on foot, eating raw potatoes. And, how lucky she was to be born here, and how lucky we were that she was born here. So now back to the story. We'll leave those up there for a while to admire them. After the return to Brussels, Jacob described their lives again as relatively normal. Food was scarce. They had a bag of flour that was stolen. There was a black market. But he says, it became obvious that the Nazis tried to make everyone comfortable. There were the Judenrat, the Jewish councils formed under the German army's command that encouraged Jews to register their family members with the local Jewish association. Jacob says that people who were, quote, more advanced, like his sister Blima, realized this was a mistake. But his father, quote, realized that if you didn't comply with the registration, the Germans could do something drastic. So after their return in 1940, Jacob doesn't remember too many anti-Jewish laws. They could still go to school. They could still listen to the radio. They could still go outside and play. But gradually, he says, as they did everywhere, they were chipping away at freedoms. They took this one away and that one away until at the end of the day, they took our lives away. Then he says it was probably 1942 that they had to start wearing the Star of David. In June or July of that year, his 3 older siblings, teenagers, quote, had to present themselves at a train station to do work at a camp in Germany. This was the first deportation notice in Brussels, possibly in all of Belgium. I just wrote in B, which was not smart of me. Blima, the resistance fighter, didn't want to go. But Jacob says, my father realized she had to because the family would be in jeopardy otherwise. He also recalls that his father, quote, made fur hats for the Germans at the beginning of the occupation. I'm not sure if it was strictly to make a living, possibly implying that his father felt if he did good business with the Nazis, maybe he would gain some favored status He did not. Lima, Sylvia, and Abram, the three oldest, were deported on the first transport out of Brussels. Jacob never saw them again. They were all murdered in the Shoah. Lila, can you? So this is a picture that I actually took out of the newspaper. Now at this point in the testimonial, so 1942, Jacob doesn't mention Flora and Jacques anymore. But based on how we know Flora and Jacques' story ended, which is in America, I can extrapolate that the two sets of parents, Jacob's and Jacques and Flora's, took the same desperate and courageous measures to spare their children. Remember from Jeannie the careful planning of their parents. So there was the official registry, and there were other registries not reported to the Nazis. Now, whether these lists were kept by Jewish groups or Belgian resistance groups or children's aid groups, I'm not sure, but Jewish parents could put their children's names on a list, and if their names were called, they would be transported to, I have to put it in quotes, safety, because we know it wasn't, but not to a work camp or a death camp. Once the parents got the call, Jacob said they were told there was no time to delay. And on September 12, 1942, the Chonyakis got the call. Jacob and his two younger brothers were transported to Wiesenbeek, one of several Jewish children's homes that existed in Belgium throughout the war. And this is a picture of one such home, the Dawson Barracks. I believe the homes were sort of arranged by age. So obviously this is for really little ones, and Jacob was about almost 13, around 12 or 13 at this time. So he was in probably one with some older children. And Wiesenbeek, which where he was run by a woman he calls a Zionist named Marie Albert. Now, I should say at this point that neither Jacques nor Flora was transported to Wiesenbeek, and I was able to confirm that with a list of home occupants maintained by the U.S. Holocaust Museum. I haven't yet been able to find Jacques or Flora's names in another such database, but I also don't know the name of all the orphanages. So I will be honest and say I didn't know where to look at this point beyond Wiesenbeek. However, it seems extremely likely that their parents took the same actions as Jacob's parents, because we know that the story ends with Jacques and Flora surviving the war, and Flora's whereabouts at liberation in a convent mirrored that of her Chonyaki cousins. And we'll get there in a minute, and we'll change the slide to an unbelievable woman named Yvonne Nevjean, and I apologize for my French pronunciation, it's not good. Yvonne Nevjean was the head of Belgium's Children's National Care Authority, which is abbreviated as ONE in French. She converted her organization's establishments across Belgium, those were homes, summer camps, rehabilitation centers, to become homes for Jewish children. She also worked closely with the clandestine Jewish Defense Committee to help place Jewish children in hiding and provide them with false papers. Jacob said, if there is a Jewish child alive in Belgium, it had to do with her. And as you can see, Nevjean was heralded as a hero by Jewish groups, by Yad Vashem and the nation of Belgium. Now, we'll soon see the next chapter. What's incredible to me is how close Jacob was to what became known historical events. And obviously, I'm not just talking about the Holocaust, but certain parts of it. And we'll see this later with Saul as well. Can you change the slide, please? So here is Elizabeth of Bavaria, Queen of the Belgians. Jacob tells the story of October 30th, 1942, a day that proves that even in safety, these Jewish children were not safe. The Gestapo came in, hitting teachers, yelling. We were supposed to be rounded up and sent to Malin. Unbeknownst to Jacob, Malin was the station where Jews were placed on death trains to Auschwitz. Before being rounded up and shoved onto a truck, he said he managed to pack a few things in a straw suitcase given to me by my parents. Touching image. Now, in another made-for-TV scene, Madame Albert, the Zionist who ran Mozambique, was able to convince the Gestapo to let the two non-Jewish women, cleaning women, go home. She said, don't take them on the transport. She handed them their pay and scrawled a phone number on the back of one of the bills, telling the woman to call it when she got home. The woman did place the call, and it was to Yvonne Nevjan and her one organization. From here, Nevjan called Elizabeth of Bavaria, the Queen of the Belgians, and the Queen intervened, imploring the Nazis to let the children stay at Mozambique. And Jacob says the Queen of Belgium, to an extent, is responsible for our being alive today. He and his brothers were supposed to be on that transport. Once again, life returned to normal at Mozambique, which Jacob says Madame Albert ran like a kibbutz. They learned Hebrew and Yiddish songs, and Shabbat was a big event. Jacob even became a bar mitzvah at Mozambique in October or November of 1942. There was a Torah there, and he questioned how that even happened. But the fact is, the Nazis allowed these homes to exist. Until they didn't anymore. I mean, but it was he lived here for 2 years in relative safety, except for these, horrifying blips. But that event, that October 30th, 1942, and Mozambique are apparently well known in Belgian history and World War II history. Now, 1944 saw a horrific change, and as Jacob tells his story, and as it's backed up in the historical record, a new and sadistic SS was put in charge of Belgium, and he made an effort to find the hiding places of all the Jews because he was hell-bent on getting all the Jews to death camps. And once again, Madame Nevjan went into action, finding hiding places and creating false documents for the Jewish children. Religious institutions at this point played a large role. Jacob and his brothers were hidden in a convent for 2 weeks before liberation. They were given false names and a cover story. Jacob became Jacques Dubacher, and he was told he was an orphan. It was the truth, unfortunately, he said, not just a cover story. Now, he said they were never in immediate danger. They never had to use their fake names. But he said the experience in the convent, quote, wasn't the most pleasant. They tried to convert us. They were taken to church on Sunday because we'd behaved well or something. I wasn't too impressed with the occasion. You have to be grateful, though, he said. Now, upon liberation, Jacob was sent to an agricultural school, and in 1947, he immigrated with his brothers to Canada. So I was shocked to learn that he was only in the convent for 2 weeks, because my impression was these children were hidden for years, and I actually don't think they were, for the most part. I think that would have been a pretty unusual circumstance. But now, what about Jacques and Flora? As I said, I can't be 100% certain that their experiences during the war followed the identical path to Jacob's, but considering the closeness of their parents and the fact that they were saved at all, I'm confident that this is how they spent their wartime years. What I do know for sure is what happened upon liberation. This also was found tucked away with the visa that I showed you before, for Saul. And remember Benny from earlier, my grandfather's brother. Well, this is a clip from the Knit Goods Workers Union newsletter, 1945, I guess. It doesn't have a date on it. And I'm just going to read it to you. It's the corner store. Oh, it's there. Okay. Finds brother's children saved by Christian neighbors. Corporal Ben Krigsman marched anxiously with the American troops as they advanced into France and Belgium. Ben had a special interest because he was concerned over the fate of his brother's family, from whom he had not heard since the beginning of the war. There was always the hope perhaps they had been saved. It was therefore with fear in his heart that Ben began to make inquiries when he reached Belgium, where his brother had been living. After considerable questioning, he finally found news of the family. His brother had been taken away by the Nazis. There was no trace of either of the parents. The two children had been saved. One, a girl of 6 years of age, was in a convent. The other, the boy of 10, had been hidden on a farm. Thus, two little Jewish children, homeless and fatherless, were saved. The neighbors who took this action faced risk and danger, but they displayed a true humane spirit. The world needs such courage and humanity. Now, so that's obviously Jacques and Flora, and Benny brought the children back to America, and they were raised in Brooklyn by their Uncle Louis and Aunt Anna Krigsman. And before we follow Jacques and Flora a little bit more in America, I want to stay in Europe for a minute. If you haven't seen these before, these are pages of testimony from Yad Vashem and relatives and loved ones of victims of the Shoah can fill them out and file them, and they are kept there for posterity. Now, the one on the left is in Yiddish, and that is filled out for Shlomo Krigsman, who, if you recall, was believed to be my grandfather and Saul's older brother. I have my doubts. He was born in Borges, so there's no question he was a relation. But there don't appear to be similar documents for Natan and Saul. I looked. The other two brothers killed in the Shoah. I would think that the submitting relative, one Hirsch Krigsman, but not my great-grandfather, obviously, would have honored the memory of all three. It's just what I suspect. And so I think Shlomo may have been a cousin, but this remains a mystery for, part two. Now, on the right in English is the page of testimony Jacob submitted for his mother, Rachel, the sister of Saul's wife, and the aunt of Jacques and Flora. He submitted pages for his father, two sisters, and brother, who were all killed in the Shoah. This is extremely grim. It is a record of Saul and Gittel's death, held at Yad Vashem. You can see, it's a catalog or a database printed that lists all of the deportees from Mechelen to Auschwitz in those 2 years. Now, and in that booklet, or from Yad Vashem, it says, Shmuel Krigsman was born in Bruges in 1904. He was a tailor and married to Gittel, née Mogzanska. During the year, he was in Cassen-Dassen, Molinas, Mechelen, Belgium. Deported with Transport 20 to Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp on the 19th of April, 1943. Saul was murdered in the Shoah, according to this source. And here again, we have incredible proximity to a historic event. On the 19th of April, 1943, the Belgian resistance staged an incredibly daring rescue attempt of Transport 20. Of the 1,638 Jews on the train, 17 were freed, 23 died, 231 fled. The rest, Saul among them, were taken to Auschwitz. And Transport 20 is the subject of the book, The 20th Train, which contains a database of the names of all the deportees. Saul and Gittel Krigsman, Meyer, and Ruchler Chonyaki were all described as stateless in the record of their deportation and subsequent death. Another indication of how these people were totally, stripped of everything, including their citizenship, obviously, because they had lived in Belgium for more than a decade. Yet they were stateless. So let's leave Europe. Let's go back to America for some brighter days. So Jacques seemed to disappear. I couldn't find anything on Jacques, which is why I only put Flora's name in the title. At the time, I did learn that he died in France in 2012 at age 80. And this article mentions that he was working as a French translator for Malagasy students in Wisconsin. But as yet, I can't find anything else establishing his whereabouts after the war. Okay, and now this is so cute. This is a letter that Flory wrote. So let's end on joy with Flora. When she was just 15 years old, in America for at most 6 years, she put pen to paper and wrote to this man, Sidney Skolsky, whose beat was Hollywood. And she was not the least bit shy about sharing her opinions about movie stars, who was best looking, who had the most sex appeal, who she liked, who she didn't like. I don't know why she didn't like Joan Fontaine and Jane Clare. Not familiar with them. But, and I love her voice. She begins, I hate writing as much as a baby hates having his spinach, but I am bursting. And since I hear it is more proper to say anything than shouting it all over, I am doing so. So, I mean, she sounds like an ordinary teenager. You can picture her on her bed reading a magazine or something. Yet she lived through such extraordinary and crushing events. Now, she went on to become a French teacher and an attorney, and by all accounts lived a full and productive life. I don't know her and will never know if she spoke of her past or how it affected her. And there she is. She died in 2016. And in closing, I want to say I am so grateful for that Flora's first cousin, Jacob Choniaki, spoke of his past, and sometimes directly and sometimes by implication of hers. I'd like to end with words from Jacob Choniaki, the cousin of my cousin. Maybe someone, like you say, may find something of interest or some relation, some connection that knows either a Choniaki somewhere or someone in the family. Perhaps that may happen, but I'm not really optimistic about that. But nevertheless, for the people that are going to do research 100 years or 1,000 years or 500 years from now, I think our story, while it is not as dramatic and it isn't as terrible as some people we know, it is still a story that we keep thinking about all the time and asking questions why we are here. And to be able to talk about it in a more official way, maybe I have put the story to rest. Jacob died in 2017. I would love to have been able to tell him that there was someone who didn't wait 100 or 1,000 or 500 years to do research, and that someone found something of interest in his story. By Jacob's putting his story to rest, my family is also able to put our story to rest, or at least to be a lot closer to doing so. So thank you to all of the relatives, my own and all of yours too, who have worked so diligently and devotedly to preserving these stories. And thank you all for listening to me.
Absolutely extraordinary. Where do you want me to go?
Wherever you want.
Who wants to say something?
Jeez. Do we have any questions?
I can start with a question. Can you imagine yourself walking 100 miles with your
No.
numerous children?
No.
So that is sort of the unthinkable. But I mean, these people probably couldn't imagine themselves doing that either when they woke up, a week before that. So, you wonder, is that something we're all capable of? And the sort of heroism of these people just trying to survive. I couldn't help but think about that. Could you put your child's name on a list, knowing that if that list their name came up, you would never see them again? It's hard to imagine.
Julie, were you able to find out whether there was family when she came to America?
She came with her uncle, with Benny, and she was raised by another Krigsman brother and his wife. Is that what you mean?
Well, but did she marry?
I'm sorry. She did not marry.
So no children.
No
of course.
children. I think Jacques didn't marry either, but that's just a guess. I'm just guessing about that, but she did not.
Is the journey over for you, or are you still
No,
on?
it's not. Of course, it's not.
I am in awe of the research and your tenacity to do this for your family. And
Thank you.
we've been sitting here with goosebumps, I think.
Aw,
But this is incredible.
thank you.
Just incredible work. Your family should be so proud of you. This is awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Exactly right. Wonderful job.
Okay.
Amazing.
Well, I do love it. I mean, and at some point, like, you become emotional, but then it's like, but I have to keep going. It's a puzzle. I mean, it's fun, but then you realize you're dealing with a thing, a deportation list of, so it's a lot of back and forth emotions. But no, I'm not done. I really do want to find out if Flory and Jacques were in a home, like one of these orphanages, like their cousins were. Like I said, I would have a really hard time believing that they were hidden for several years in a convent or on a farm. And the fact that Benny found them, I think, speaks to the fact that they were hidden through an official organization and not just handed over to the Catholic family down the street or something. That's my educated guess.
I'm sorry if I missed when you started the process
Oh, I didn't say.
of looking, and also kind of what gave it the momentum, like, when you started and when you really.
The truth is, I don't remember exactly why I started, except that I was a little, like I said, the story always stuck in my head. And then I had access, and I learned how to do genealogy. And like, I couldn't resist. It was too much for me not to do. And so I actually first watched the Shoah video testimonial in sometime early 2021, excuse me. I was able to it's not publicly available, only a handful of them are, but luckily it was at the BU Law Library, and my daughter Rachel goes to BU, so she had access, and she got me the video. Yeah. So I was able to watch it, and I can't even tell you, like, the chills when I heard relatives' names that I was waiting to hear. It was as if it was like a put on, almost, like, oh, he knows that. I mean, obviously he didn't know, but so, and then the impetus to go back to it was the LIZKOR project here that I felt I wanted to, and there's still more to do.
Good. We'll call on you.
Okay. Got a couple other stories up my sleeve.
Okay.
I was curious how you were drawn to her story in particular. Of all this data you found, how did you end up focusing on her and her brother?
I think because of the convent story, and I will say, like, they were always a little exotic to me and Abby.
We had always heard their names. Jacques
and Flora. I mean,
Jacques and Flory.
Right, exactly, and the fact that they were in Belgium and not Poland, which is where most of our family was from. They just had there was an air about this story that always stuck with me. But I was saying to Ellie before that the title no longer kind of fits because I learned so much about her father, Saul, who I also set out to learn about. But I feel like, he's deserving of a little mention in the title. So that's why, that it really was like a kind of a childhood fascination with these people.
Well, let us say thank you
Well,
so,
you're very
so much
welcome.
for
Thank
sharing
you.
the story. We'll look forward to part 2, or part 3, or however long it goes.
I need to build up some more time.
It's been quite inspiring, the
Oh,
work
thank
you've done. Thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you again, Julie. I don't know. I'm really struck by the word coincidences also, and thinking about certainly there are coincidences, and Jacob's. I hope I'm getting the names right. Jacob says, you know, we don't know how we survived, and also says, and if it weren't for this person, we wouldn't be alive, and if it weren't for this person, we wouldn't be alive, and the incredible heroism of individuals during this time. And lifting up the righteous among the nations. So, wow. Thank you, Julie, for sharing your story. Thank you, everyone, for being here.